Welcome to this episode of Office Hours at Vanderbilt Divinity School, Lifelong Learning. I'm Dr. Nathan Kost. I am joined today by Dr. Aly Benitez, who for at least a few more weeks is the assistant professor of the practice of religion, psychology, and culture here at VDS and director of field ed. And in just a few weeks will be the new assistant professor of pastoral theology, psychology, and Latiné studies. Aly, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Greetings from the office space in a time of transition. But such is life.
Yeah, if you were wondering whether or not those bookshelves have always been empty, they haven't. If you're watching, if we could expand the camera angle, you would see cardboard boxes full of them as Aly moves out, which I'm still not really willing to accept, Aly, but I don't think, give me a couple more weeks and I'll hit that stage of the grief cycle, okay?
I hear you.
Yeah.
Hey, always a phone call away, though.
That's it. So, Aly, you've got a lifelong learning course that actually just went live today. It's called Autohistoria, or Writing is Healing, Autohistory or Autohistoria for Spiritual Caregivers. So before we jump into that, my question to you is, without using your title or the word professor, what do you do?
I love this question because it is at the heart of what I consider myself to do in this space, which is the work of accompaniment with folks to help them gain greater awareness about themselves, how they would like to identify, how they are identifying and showing up in the world, and that these terms that they use to name themselves mean and are self-defined by them and through the experiences that shape them, not by stereotypes or misunderstandings that the world or others have about them. That's what I consider myself doing.
Well, first of all, accompaniment. Will you unpack that for folks? When you say accompaniment, what do you mean?
Yeah, so when I consider the work of accompaniment, it means journeying with the person, right? So if we're thinking about becoming self-aware or engaging in self-reflective practices, if I'm doing this work with you, it means that together we are in dialogue about your experience, and I'm an active listener, and I'm curious about what you're sharing, and I want to understand the world through your lens and your culture and your language, as opposed to me prescribing or giving you something that I think is applicable to define or explain your experience.
I see such an overlap between the course and your actual definition of what it is that you do, right? So your course is Auto History, Writing is Healing for Spiritual Caregivers. Now, for folks that don't know, will you tell us what auto history is?
See, so the term that we're using through Chicana feminist thought, particularly through Chicana cultural theorist whose name is Gloria Anzaldúa, we're using the term Autohistoria Teoría to describe the ways in which we can create theory, create knowledge based on our lived experiences. So if you break down the word auto, turning to self, history, considering the stories and histories, right? Not just what's happening now, but both what we long for, well, all three. What is here, what we long for, and the histories that came before us, right? So leaving no stone turned untouched, so to speak, and then thinking about what are all the narratives that lie within my being and in my mind that shape who I am. So we're looking at autohistoria and then teoría. So the second part of the word considers the ways in which we can create theory, and in other words, knowledge, out of our lived experience, so that we're not always engaging with texts outside of ourselves, but that we become the source and we are the text that's creating knowledge.
Okay. Let's start at the ground level. What is it about the Chicana experience or Chicana feminism that gave voice to Autohistoria Teoría?
That's a great question. I would say that a lot of the experience might come from histories of marginalization and not having an identity that one can claim or that one feels identified with, histories of exclusion and a long trajectory of trying to claim self and our own identity. So I believe that Chicana feminism does that work. It also, in the process, focuses a lot on what constructs the self, what constructs my being, right? And so a lot of that is the work that Chicana feminism does.
So and Aly, I've been working on my pronunciations, by the way. I practiced, okay? Does Autohistoria Teoría emerge from or is it a response in some way to the colonial experience?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot. This is something that for me has become very exciting to learn more about because there are a lot of different approaches to care and that are narrative based, that are folks centering self, right? So, in a sense, Chicana feminism is not doing something new. It is joining a long line of this way of approaching telling story and creating knowledge, right? But one thing that I do think it does in particular. So it joins the choir with decolonial approaches and that meaning of like taking into consideration how colonialism has affected us in what ways it has created divisions between us and them and the other. But I specifically see something happening with Chicana feminism that draws into spirit and into contemplating the ideological constructs in our mind, right? The way that we think about either or instead of both and, right? So, kinds of examples of this is that when we talk about stories or knowledge production, we create divisions such as the intellect from emotion or theory from experience or spirituality from body, right? It's like you can either speak one thing or the other. But Chicana feminism, it's saying one of the harms that colonialism did is that it created this borderland. It created this binary where we either conform to or are not good enough. And so they are looking to change that and to blur those lines and invite us into a both and way of living.
So it sounds like another influence that Autohistoria Teoria is responding to is that sort of Cartesian duality, right? That knowledge is like this disembodied thing that's out there, and the body itself is, our senses can deceive us and can't be trusted.
That's right.
Is that right? That it's also pushing back against that to say that it's not a binary.
It's doing exactly that. It's not a binary and it's inviting us to put together mind, body, spirit, right? So it's bringing it all into a more holistic approach of care where we're saying that it all matters. You know, what happens in society is impacting how we view the world and our place in it, how we consider God's presence in it even, right? And then also the experiences that mark us shape our lens into how we're looking at the world outside, right? And it's not just one or the other. It's both and happening at the same time. I've mentioned Ansaldúa earlier, and one of the questions that she always wrestled with, and she's such a central figure to my approach, at least to Autohistoria and to Chicana feminism. I often come back to her. But one of the questions that she always struggled with was what needs to change, like for transformation, for spiritual and social transformation to happen, what has to change first? Does the world have to change for us to become healthier? Or do I have to change for us to be able to create a better world, right? And she concluded that it's both. There has to be mutual transformation happening at individual and also collective levels. So that's also part of the work of blurring that dualistic line.
Yeah. Well, as spiritual caregivers, and this is not my field, but as spiritual caregivers, you don't encounter people in binaries, right? You know, I was joking just at the beginning of this conversation about the cycle of grief, right?
Yeah.
But you don't encounter somebody that's grieving seriously, you don't encounter somebody that's grieving as they either are or they're not, or they fit in this box or that box, right? Because they're not understanding themselves that way.
They are not.
Is that accurate, Aly?
It's true. And I'm smiling big because what started all of this, through my education here at Vanderbilt, because I was a student here before becoming a faculty member. And I came here with a lot of questions that I was holding precisely about this, right, that you're naming. And realizing that my former training before coming here was in chaplaincy. And that's where I realized, grief has such a power to be able to shape story. Grief can soften us or grief can harden us. And there are no simplistic answers when it comes to grief. So there I was for all these years as a chaplain. And my faith background is also as a Seventh-day Adventist. And I would remember, trying to have what's my integrity here is that how far can I join somebody else's theology as they are processing their grief if our theological stance is different, right? So I had that as a huge concern, like, how do I create this bridge? And I remember I used to carry a pocketbook with, it was like the Seventh-day Adventist faith tradition in comparison to 25 other denominations and other religious traditions. And I was trying to learn, like, where is the bridge? And I thought I could go there with the person in the areas in which we share commonalities. But what I often discovered is that in a time of grief, there's too much complexity to find any kind of theological common ground that is based on doctrines or faith traditions, right? So what becomes imperative is how we are showing up and becoming very, very generative and productive, active listeners with folks who are telling their stories. And I would sometimes find that even the bullet points that I had on the handbook about their faith tradition, as they're trying to wrestle with grief, it's not matching up to the handbook. It's like, it's not what this says, that, according to this doctrine, that this is how we should experience God working in this time of grief. But for me, those experiences made theology and relationship with God and faith more rich and more alive. I don't know if that's making, translating well here, but what I'm saying is that it was the tensions that were the most transformative for me and the person that was receiving care for me at the time as a chaplain, right? So it wasn't about let's find the answer. It's more about hold the complexity with me. I'm trying to make sense out of all of this, and not all of it makes sense.
What you're describing, that place of tension, it reminds me of the concept you mentioned earlier, but you also discussed it at length in your course of borderlands.
Yes,
Would that be an accurate title for what you just explained? And if so, could
absolutely.
you unpack
Yeah.
that a bit for folks?
Yeah, if you think of it visually, right? If we've been taught to think in very dualistic ways, right? And even if we think of the biblical terms of the haves and the excuse me, when we think of the biblical divisions between the haves and the have-nots, right? There's those who are whose being is recognized, and those whose being are not as recognized, right? The have-nots at the bottom. And so when you think of these two divisions and you put a line in the middle, right, there's this borderland space, right? And borderlands theory comes out of Ansaldua's work in her book Borderlands La Frontera, that is saying, but there is this space of tension, there is this space of rebellion, there is the space for who she calls los atravesados, those who cross over, those who dare to cross that boundary and resist this splitting. So that is one way to conceptualize a borderland, right? That it's a place of tension where we don't rush prematurely to having answers, but rather stay with the tension and try to figure out what is happening here, right? So if we approach it that way, then Autohistoria Teoria, as a tool, as a method, as a writing exercise, becomes all the more imperative, because in a sense, we have to unlearn the binary logic that we've been taught.
When did you encounter Autohistoria Teoria? Just personally, when did you first really engage with this?
I would say I didn't have the words to name it, but Autohistoria Teoria probably came with my own resistance, and I don't mean my own in a singular way, because I really do believe that God was working with me in my own journey of self-awareness and being able to claim my identity. So I've been outspoken about this in terms of, being identifying as a Christian and a queer person. These are seemingly oppositional, right? It's one's up here, the other one's not. And so for me, that hurt a lot to feel so split, and it fragmented my mind, body, spirit. And yet here I am in a theology such as Seventh-day Adventism that says holistic care. We care about mind, body, spirit. We care about the whole person. So already I'm in this borderland space, feeling both the rejection, but also the invitation, right, to become whole. And so I think just internally, there was already this resistance in me that said, I can't throw it all away. I have to make sense out of all these fragmentations and create a new narrative. But I didn't have space. I didn't have the language. I didn't have communities that could hold that, right? And so then that led me into this long academic journey. I'm here, because I continue to have so many more questions about meaning making and becoming whole persons and spiritual care. And so all of that questioning led me here. And it was through courses here at Vanderbilt that I was introduced first to Chicana feminism in a small essay that they shared in class about Gloria Saldúa. Then it just took over. Then it became a dissertation.
Yeah. Well, you say at one point in one of your lectures, and it really caught me, that for many of us, telling our story and coming, I've written here, telling our story and coming to voice is a means of survival. And I had a question to say, can you unpack that for us? But I'm wondering if, as you're considering, you talk about the cognitive dissonance between your sexual orientation and the doctrine of your faith community, and in the middle of that is your vocation that says, I'm trying to provide and receive holistic care, but that can't happen apparently in this current framework. So it sounded to me like it was a means of vocational survival for you.
And also that, yeah, yes. And I think also that for many clergy, particularly, I'm thinking about them right now who are in open and affirming spaces, right? Where the community, like the local community, the local church can create a space that is open and affirming. And yet there is this larger doctrine, right? And yet there's this larger body of what constitutes the church where there are certain things that cannot happen, right? Or certain ways or certain rituals that maybe queer folks also can't be a part of. And that's a very painful space to be in, right? I think for both, for someone who's trying to create the space knowing what the opposition is, but also for queer folks like us who step into congregational spaces that are open and affirming and slightly feel a bait and switch, right? Of I'm here in the pew, but maybe I'm not reflected in the sermon. I'm here among community members and churchgoers, but the rituals of, say, marriage are not also extended to me, right? And so I think that these are very real, live, real-time examples and experiences that are happening right now where we can say there's tension there, right? As much as there's hope, as much as there's welcoming and transformation happening, there's also the tension of the limitations that we're experiencing because we continue to live in a society and in a world that others, right? And so Autohistoria Teoria and Borderlands theory has been very influential for me because it's a theory of change, right? And we know that change is very slow, but it's saying to us, hold on, become more flexible, become more expansive, become more theologically imaginative, right? In the ways that we can interpret ourselves and our world and the ways that we create and shape culture and transmit it to younger generations coming after us.
And I want to hone in on that change part, because it's not just a theory, right? There's actually a journey of transformation, and I've got it here. It's the path of the conocimiento. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
That there's actually a transformational process or path that you go on when you engage or live into this, embody this methodology or method. Could you talk
Yes,
about that for us?
I would love to. So the Path of Conocimiento was also written by Gloria Ansaldúa in an essay they called it's called Now Let Us Shift, the Path of Conocimiento, Inner Work, Outer Change. Inner Work, excuse me. It comes from the essay that is titled Now Let Us Shift, the Path of Conocimiento, Inner Work, Public Acts. And in this essay, Ansaldúa walks us through a 7-stage process. And I say stage and pause because she also didn't believe that we can go through this with Western logic in a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and get all the way through 7, and then say, "Ta-da! Transformation has happened." We
So
know
it's
that that's not.
non-linear. Is that
It's
right?
nonlinear.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a nonlinear and recursive process. But if you walk it 1 through 7, you feel the shifts, which is why the title is also becomes so important, right? And so, for example, the first step is a rupture or an arrebato, right? When we encounter a moment of difference that shaped the narrative or this grand narrative that we used to hold. And we allow ourselves to create space to process that, right? So we hold foundational truths and we hold frameworks very tightly. But sometimes things will happen that say it just doesn't fit the narrative that I've been taught. Will I let that arrebato, that rupture, this tension that I'm starting to feel in my body take place and let it teach me? Can I hold on to it long enough to create new knowledge? Or will I say, stop? Truth says this thing, or this identity can only be this. That's a choice, right? But the first thing that happens is a rupture. After that, we move, and let me try to go through this a little quick for brevity for this conversation, but there's 7 steps, and she has gone, and not only her, but many scholars have also picked up on conocimiento and adapted in many different contexts of ministry. So, because it's a theory of change, right? And so the first is the rupture. The second, you go to Nepantla, which is a space of liminality, right? Moving beyond the both and, moving beyond the either or and embracing a both and. So allowing ourselves that flexibility to inhabit a third space so that we can process differently the things that we've been taught. And then it goes to the Coatlicue state, which is a state of, she describes it as a dark space, in that we might get depressed with the new realities that we are encountering, right? And when we encounter new knowledge, it does also call us into a possibly moral obligation, right? Of like, now that it's one thing that I didn't know something, but now that I do know it, how am I holding myself accountable? What new narratives will I move into? And so sometimes releasing those narratives means disconnect from certain communities and certain ways of being that are no longer serving us, but that were possibly never life-giving to begin with. Then she moves to the fourth, which is the step of el compromiso, saying, okay, now that I've done this inner work and I continue to do it, what are my new commitments to the world and to myself and to the communities around me? And then she comes down to putting Coyolxauhqui together, which is a process that has to do with taking the fragments and creating a new story, right? So how do I now take this renewed awareness of myself and this renewed awareness of a theological framework and create a new story to tell it to the world, to preach about, to let it influence my spiritual care practices, right? So for example, the top-down model moves. So how do I become more horizontal and work with the person and consider even the person as someone who's teaching me, right? People can also teach us when we are offering spiritual care. The sixth step has to do with a clash of realities. And for me, this is a really important step too, because in the process of change, this is where we're also able to gauge our own thresholds. A clash of realities is that, for example, when you become an advocate for marginalized communities and start speaking, how we say of truth to power, right? Like when we start speaking and saying the hard truths, sometimes there will be communities that will embrace us and other times they will not. And so this clash of realities has to do with hanging on and being perseverant, right? Of like, this new narrative that I'm so excited about, I tried it out and sometimes it hurt me and it backfired. And a lot of times we become discouraged when that happens. And so we go all the way back to the arrebato stage, the rupture, and we say, forget it. Let me just stay with the old narrative, right? And so we limit the possibility for change because that clash was so hard. And so lastly, the seventh step is, as we measure our own thresholds, can we move into a mode where we are able to shift realities? Ansadu also describes this as a place where nepantleras live, which are the bridge makers, right? Can we become flexible enough that we can approach difference in a way that's not adversarial, but rather that we can express curiosity about what these differences are and come to commonalities and terms and values, right, in which we can hold common ground, respecting the human dignity of all.
Yeah, what I really love about this, Aly, is that it sounds like, as somebody that's not, again, I don't work in this field, but it sounds like it's both prescriptive in that there are There are actions that you need to take, right? But it's also descriptive of it just gives a voice to the way that change happens to us and how we participate in it.
Yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
that's really beautiful. I think oftentimes what we want is we're like, give me the 7 steps to transformation, right? Like,
Yes.
here are the 10 things I need to do to,
Get through the process.
to do whatever, to get whatever I want. And what the path of conocimiento is both gives language to the experience and prescribes steps within that experience.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you underscored that too, because part of that is also that we learn that this process, of change and transformation, again, like it doesn't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen if I just do all the journaling, all my life writing, all my autoethnography, and right. If I no, it's I and we, right? Because if I claim, for example, when I started claiming myself proudly, I had to conocimiento worked for me in that I moved from a place of shame to a place of celebration, for my identity as both queer and Christian, right? Understanding that the larger narrative out there doesn't hold these together as one, but that in my being, they are one. Right. And the importance here is that in this process, it's like I also need community to reflect that back, right? If I just said it for myself, by myself, to myself, it doesn't give that power, right? And so this is where community also becomes so important to doing this work. We do this together. We do this through and with the differences, not in adversarial modes about them, but in a way that we remain curious and humble and constantly learning.
I want to shift gears for just a second here, Aly. You mentioned journaling and life writing and autoethnography. So one of the things that you do in your course is you begin with, this is what journaling is, right? And move us all the way through to life writing, autoethnography, autohistoria, and then autohistoria teoria. And then you close in your final lecture by saying, once we've gone through the process, how then do we use it as a tool to provide spiritual care for others?
Yeah.
And that's the question that I want to ask you is what are the possibilities for spiritual care providers if they do embrace or embody autohistoria teoria? I mean, let me say it a different way. What do you risk missing if you don't use autohistoria teoria?
Oh, that's so good. Long, long ago, I remember that someone said to me through spiritual caregiving and chaplaincy training more specifically, that we can only go so far when we talked about accompaniment, right? Like we can only accompany folks so far as the work that we have done for ourselves. And it made so much sense to me, right? Of like, how could I possibly say that I know more because I've read more, because I've gone to school, because here I have this position as chaplain, right? But I'm not that person who is telling me their story, right? And so if I myself haven't gone through an experience, how can I understand how the person is also trying to make sense out of theirs, right? And so that was my first big lesson in terms of I have to put myself into doing this work as well, right? So I am inviting folks to go through the steps of conocimiento, write about yourself and your being and how you are in tension or have been hurt possibly, right, by grand narratives and what you're trying to discover, the questions you hold about healing, right? Like, let it be a mess. I think sometimes we limit ourselves because we're trained to think very linearly and go to the source, cite it, and like you said earlier, Nathan, have your steps 1 through 5, check, done, got it. But it's when we talk about spiritual caregiving, right? The whole self has to be immersed in this process. So moving now to like the last module, what it's doing is it's asking what happens when we bring insights of autohistoria into spiritual care, right? Having gone through the process ourselves. What changes? I think a lot does because we first learn to become storytellers, right? We learn to tell our stories. So we learn how difficult, if you think back to these 7 steps that I've named, right? Like there's a lot of journeying in these 7 steps that are very complex, but also are like this light in the dark. There's hope for transformation, just all throughout it, right? And so we learn to do this, and then we learn also to hold stories. And I think that's the biggest thing, right? We move. There's a shift that happens from being able to tell stories to being able to hold stories. And what we mean by that is holding stories. Think about curating space, right? Whether it's in a one-on-one or in a congregational space or a workshop that you're doing, how do you curate space for folks to walk tenderly, carefully, and ethically with folks to tell their story? Because inevitably it's going to be a very vulnerable space, right? So that's something that is possible to do when we go through it and also apply it in space. And I think it also, when we are able to model it with those that we are working with, they trust also happens. It happens more rapidly than, let's have 7 workshops before we can ask the big question. So if I'm able to say that as a spiritual caregiver, right, the power that I hold in this room is my vulnerability. And let me show you a glimpse of how I've walked through this process, what has been yours, right? Then it becomes a sacred space of sharing, learning, and becoming open to transformation.
Yeah, you're right. Or you say, Autohistoria invites us to engage with story as care. It asks what happens when we enter into relationship instead of observation. What happens when we allow our own story to be present, not as a way of centering ourselves, but as a way of being accountable to the encounter. And what does it mean to be accountable to the encounter?
Prioritize the encounter, to prioritize it over the responses of care that you have been trained to offer, right? So it's again a both and process that yes, people come seeking because they might not have all of the tools or language or resources. So we come in and are able to facilitate, right, these options and these skills and these processes with them. But if we prioritize the encounter, it's let me also hold with you what this tension is, right? So somebody says this is really hard or this angers me, to simply be able to echo that. I feel the hurt. I can sense it as you're naming it. I feel also the anger. This is a difficult space, and holding that, right? Something as simple as that goes a very long way because it is validating the person who is narrating, who is telling their story. And I think that also goes a very long way, as opposed to, anger is a secondary response. Underneath that, you might be experiencing sadness. Are you sad right now? We've missed the encounter,
Yeah.
because we've prioritized something cognitive that we've learned in academic space.
Yeah. I'm going to say something that's very obvious, but as someone that's not a professional spiritual care provider, it's helpful for me to hear. It's a way of being fully present to
Yes,
to the relationship, to the experience, to the human being that is in front of me, not just intellectually present.
right. Mind, body, spirit, all of it. Yeah. And what is present in this present time, right? So often we think that healing is over there. And I've learned this too, even theologically interrogating, right? When I think about salvation, right? That it was taught to me as a one-time event, something that happens in a future. And so we wait for it to happen then, right? Or even resurrection, right? At a later time. But when we stay present and consider the body, the mind, and the spirit right now, salvation and resurrections are happening many times, right? So they happen through moments of change, through moments when somebody is affirmed, through times of listening and saying, I am here, right? That moments of healing, something happened, something changed. I felt more supported. The ways in which there are ways in everyday life in which we're coming alive again and again from things that we weren't aware about. And it's a joy to enter that space with folks.
Isn't it incredible how much of our spiritual lives, well, let me rephrase that. We often think of our spiritual lives or spirit as something that's out of body that I'm actually going to sort of separate myself from my body in order to encounter. But those rich experiences actually happen when I'm fully present in my body, right? When I'm fully embodied. Dr. Phyllis Shepherd said a few weeks ago on a podcast about the Desert Mothers that this idea of detachment as a way of being more present in the world, not as a way of escaping it, right? And what I'm hearing you talking when you talk about Autohistoria is that it is a way to be fully present to those, not only to the human being that's in front of me, but to the impact that we are having on one another in that moment, the way we are forming one another.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I know that in the module, for example, we're addressing Autohistoria Teoria as like a lot of writing, right? But all of the writing exercises are invitation to do more than writing exercises, but to consider narrating our stories and coming to voice. One of the modules goes into that of like, what does it mean to come to voice and consider the things that I have to say. And so for me, Autohistoria is also a spiritual care practice that is helping people make meaning out of their lives by bringing together story, community, spirituality, identity, culture, all of it into conversations. Like, I know it sounds messy, and I hear it, and I know that when I was a newcomer to all this, it's just like, it's not the linear way we've been taught. But that's the point about the Historia Teoria, or one of the many joys that it brings, is that we can create meaning out of the mess. We can hold these tensions and find ourselves renewed by them and not outside of them.
Just two more questions for you. Okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So for many of us in academia, writing actually is painful, right? And part of it is because we are trained to write a certain kind of way in order to produce a certain kind of argument. It can be quite linear, and that's part of the pain, right? And with Autohistoria, it's not just one type of writing, right? Or one style of writing. Isn't it Sotomayor who talks about being playful or using the arts as quote writing? So could you expand on when you talk about writing, tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think of one of the, well, first I want to say you're addressing like the modalities of Autohistoria, which is also really exciting in knowing that we can write and rewrite self through different forms. It could be through the letters, right? It could be playing with clay. It could be walking through a museum and interpreting art. It could be making art. It could be music. I mean, I can go on and on. Because many Chicana feminists look to art, they look to cultural figures, to symbols, to ancestral knowledge, right? And we pull from all of this and say, what is it telling me? What's the newness here that I can encounter as far as the stories that the ancestors told or how they understood themselves that I can also bring into my own life? And so the writing, so now I move into this writing and rewriting. It has to do with the fact that there's so many identity categories out there, which is wonderful because it represents how vast we are as human beings, and it reflects all of the diversity as well. And yet, when we take these categories, like these identity markers, there's already a story that has been written about them. Right? So think about it in your gender, race, sexuality, religion. There's already a dominant story that has been written about it. So when you say, I'm this and I'm this, it feels like I have to fit all of the categories of each of these boxes. But, identities are not stagnant. And so trying to fit in one box actually ends up fracturing the self. So we need more expansion, more fluidity, and more ways of approaching this process by giving ourselves permission to rewrite these stories. So I hope that helps to clarify it a little bit more, right? It's like, it's the writing and rewriting, not so much in just the script or the text was written and predefined or define this identity, but in recognizing that dominant narratives create ideologies and shape ways of living and being and experiencing the world that we can challenge, that we can reshape, that we can transform. And I'm specifically speaking about those that cause hurt and are death dealing instead of life giving. Those are the things we want transformed or rewritten.
I think what I'm hearing is the typical model for the typical theological model is we're going to create a universal, right? Some universal truth that is going to apply to everybody. And then we're going to try to live within that universal truth, right? And I think it sounds like you experienced it early on when you were talking about your vocation as a holistic spiritual care provider and the doctrine of your faith community, they didn't line up, right? And so what Autohistoria does, it sounds to me, is it begins with the lived experience rather than beginning with the universal. And it's
That's
a
right.
way of processing what happens when my identity doesn't fit within the box of the narrative, whether that's a religious narrative, a cultural narrative, racial narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, this is just such a rich, such incredibly rich. I don't know if you want to call it practice. It's a method, but I know you
Practice
also
method.
say it's a tool, but it's not just like a quick fix.
Yeah, it's an invitation to a way of being in the world, right? So recognizing conocimiento as an ongoing life work, right? Recognizing that, you know, even as I've gone through, let's say, I go through many cycles of conocimiento for personal, professional,
Sure.
many reasons.
Yeah.
I apply it,
Yeah.
because it helps me a lot. But then, so I've gone through the conocimiento and I'm here. And then someone said something to me, or a life event happened, right? And so it shattered that story, right? That I had already cohesed and put together. So then what it does is it invites us, well, if that was an arrebato, if that was a rupture, what else is it teaching you, right? And so we continue engaging this cycle of growth. And when we do this, so when we apply conocimiento as a lifestyle, we are also very mindful of the way that change is happening, and we become open to it, right? As opposed to holding the rigidity of it and say, what else is life teaching me?
Well, one last question for you, and as we wrap up, and I like ending on this question. What do you hope your students walk away with after they encounter Autohistoria in your course?
That for anyone who comes and partakes in Autohistoria Teoria and writing through this module, that they come out with a deep love for themselves, with renewed encouragement also about the ways that they want to show up in their context of ministry, with a hunger for continued growth in their own pastoral formation, with curiosity for perspectives out in the world that are not limiting, and that healing also happens for them in this process, because that's the first thing that we do, right? We confront our own hurts, our own wounds. We look at them and we don't let them take over, but rather we engage in conversation with them to say, what did I learn? And part of that process means that a lot of the ways that we might be feeling because of the hurt that we're holding was imposed or inherited or acquired along the way of our life narrative, but that we have some agency here. There is this hope, there is this light in the dark again, where we can rewrite ourselves and tell another story.
Dr. Aly Benitez, thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you all of the best at Garrett.
Thank you
And
so much.
folks, Writing is Healing, Autohistoria for Spiritual Caregivers, asynchronous online, and it's live as of today. So don't miss out on that one. Take good care, Dr. Benitez.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining the course.